Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. In just a moment, Attorney General Jeff Sessions joins us for an exclusive interview to talk about the day's avalanche of news. But first tonight, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI. He's announced he is cooperating with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's ongoing investigation. Flynn admits he lied about the extent of the conversations he had with the Russian ambassador to Washington, Sergei Kislyak. Flynn is the first member of the Trump administration to be criminally charged in this investigation, so this is a major development. The question is, what exactly does it mean? Flynn has admitted taking money from an unfriendly foreign government, the Erdogan regime in Turkey, in order to influence American policy as the incoming national security advisor. If that's not illegal, it ought to be illegal. It's certainly a betrayal of trust and possibly a betrayal of this country's vital national interests. It's appalling behavior. It's also depressingly common in Washington, which may be why Flynn has not been prosecuted for it. It's so conventional, nobody considers it wrong, though it is wrong. But back to the charges that were actually filed today. Keep in mind that Mueller's probe began in order to investigate claims that Russia influenced the 2016 election or even directly colluded with the Trump campaign in order to alter the outcome of that election. Flynn's guilty plea today does not prove that claim. In fact, it undercuts it. Flynn admits he lied about initiating contact with Kislyak last December. Check a calendar. That's a month after the November election. Too late to sink the Hillary campaign. There goes that theory. Instead, Flynn was apparently trying to promote U.S. interests. According to the indictment of him today, passed out by the Mueller people, he urged Russia not to overreact to sanctions implemented by the Obama administration, and he urged Russia also not to veto a UN resolution condemning Israel. By the way, that second effort failed. Now, you can debate whether it was a good idea or not for the Trump transition team to contact foreign representatives before formally taking power. Maybe it wasn't a good idea, but there certainly is precedent for it. In 2008, Barack Obama repeatedly had his surrogates meet with foreign officials. In 1980, Vice President-elect George H.W. Bush spoke with numerous ambassadors on Ronald Reagan's behalf. When Robert Mueller was first named special counsel, we warned, as many did, that these investigations rarely stay limited to their original purpose, and they frequently wind up entrapping people whose only crime is the false testimony they provide during the investigation. So far, nothing has happened to disprove that warning. If investigators can prove that the Trump campaign worked with Vladimir Putin in order to steal the 2016 election, by all means, prosecute. We'll be the first to cheer that on, to call for longer prison terms, because that's a crime. But this? So far, it's hard to know exactly how this makes America better. Robert Ray knows a lot about these kinds of investigations. He's a former federal prosecutor. He succeeded Ken Starr as the special counsel investigating the Clinton administration, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Ray, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So, from what we know now, what is this about? What's the point, do you think, of indicting General Flynn on this charge?
Well, independent of a special counsel investigation, obviously false statements to the FBI are a serious issue that may well warrant prosecution, and that prosecution was brought. I mean, I think people have known from the earliest stages of the Mueller investigation that both Manafort and Flynn had exposure,
right,
and they've now both been prosecuted. The second piece of significance is that General Flynn is cooperating with Mueller's investigators, so we've now learned and confirmed that for the first time today. That's also significant.
I assume the exposure would stem from his lobbying for the Erdogan government in the months before he became National Security Advisor, which strikes me as immoral, if not illegal, but that's not included in this. I wonder if you can guess what the special prosecutor believes he's moving toward.
Well, that was a little hard to figure out. I mean, I looked at it today to see just a false statements prosecution by a defendant who is cooperating with the investigation. If where you think they would be going, which would be a proof of a conspiracy to commit a violation of the Logan Act, you would have expected a cooperating defendant to have pleaded guilty to that charge if what he's going to do in the future is cooperate against others in an effort to help the government make that charge. So it's odd, to say the least, that only a false statements case was brought against him, suggesting at least the possibility that this doesn't go any place further, beyond his own criminal misconduct.
So, and not to minimize that, you shouldn't lie to federal agents, it's a crime, but now you've had 4 people charged, and it's possible that it's not leading towards some kind of legal crescendo where the president himself is charged with something or people even closer to the president?
Well, Bob Mueller's task is to find the facts and take them wherever they may lead. Where they may lead may be no place, meaning no further than this. We don't know yet. We don't know what else he has. I mean, I think everything up to this point has always suggested that it was inevitable that Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn would be prosecuted. I think most reasonable, knowledgeable observers of the investigation had concluded long ago that that's where the investigation at least would go. Now, whether it goes further or not, who's to say?
So Flynn's cooperating in order to do what? Do we have any guess?
Well, to help investigators determine whether or not other crimes have been committed. But, as I suggested, I'm reading between the lines, and so you can't, say for certain. But it is an odd development if they really had more, why they didn't demand that Michael Flynn plead guilty to more.
Right.
And it suggests at least the possibility that the reason that didn't happen is because he doesn't have more.
I don't want to in any way minimize the seriousness, again, of dishonesty, which is a crime, and it's wrong. However, the rest of us have kind of assumed this was about collusion with the Russians in the 2016 election. That's certainly
a reasonable conclusion to draw. And
the
first question you always ask in an obstruction of justice or false statements investigation or charge is, what are they lying or obstructing justice for?
Well, exactly. That's exactly it. And all of us assume that the point was they believed there was some conspiracy to subvert the election, but these charges, Mueller's description of them today, undercut that completely.
It suggests at least the possibility that one of the reasons that he may have been lying was because, with regard to conduct that occurred in December during the transition, because it was a politically difficult thing to do, he didn't want to disclose to the public or to anybody else the fact that there in fact were contacts with Russian government officials. That doesn't mean that that makes it a crime. It just means that he was, covering up for the administration because he didn't think that it was appropriate to disclose that information. He didn't tell the truth about it. Bad idea with regard to telling that to the FBI. And if he had had a lawyer present, and my understanding is he didn't have a lawyer present, a lawyer would have certainly counseled him about the dangers of making false statements to federal agents.
If that's as far as this goes, this is a massive waste of time, and we're all owed an apology, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, you can say that, but also it's important, if there's no there, for there to be a full investigation and to actually at the end of it come forward and say, you know what, we've looked at this fully and there's no there, and that's the end of it. That's what Ty Cobb, the president's lawyer, seemed to be suggesting today. The White House is committed to a full effort to cooperate with investigators, and that we hope that this will lead now to the beginning of the end and an expeditious conclusion to the investigation. Let's hope so. I have said all along that I really do hope the lessons of history have been learned and that Bob Mueller can conclude his investigation, well in advance of the midterm elections.
Yes.
I still think that's possible, but it depends on, things that we obviously don't know yet.
In advance of the 2020 elections, even.
Well, but I'm even more hopeful with the midterms that happens sometime, earlier rather than later next year.
I think that's something to hope for. Mr. I thank you for coming.
Thanks very much for having me.
Appreciate it. Flynn's guilty plea is naturally big news for the president's own legal team. How will they respond to today's developments? Brad Blakeman is an attorney. He advised the Trump transition. He joins us tonight. So, Brad, how, if you're in the White House right now, do you respond to this news about General Flynn?
You don't say anything. You let the investigation take its course. There's good news in this plea that was taken by Flynn, and that is what your guest alluded to, and you in the earlier segment, and that is that there doesn't seem to be any there with collusion, coercion, conspiracy with regard to the Trump campaign and the Russians trying to influence the election. There's no doubt the Russians tried, and they weren't successful in interfering with our election. The good news is it doesn't appear to be a conspiracy by a candidate or his campaign to help in that effort.
Flynn, clearly a bad hiring decision to bring on General Flynn, who again was lobbying for the Turkish government at the time. But do you think within the White House they have any idea where this is going or what the point of the investigation is at this point?
I don't think they know, but certainly Flynn was given a very good deal based on the information that he had proffered to the FBI. The question is who's next in the sights of the investigation. But, you know, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, I don't believe this is about collusion or conspiracy with the Russians now. I think it's about lying.
Yeah.
Did the people who talked to the FBI lie about their involvement? You may think you're doing something wrong when in fact you're not. And certainly there was nothing improper with Flynn or anybody else as President-elect's transition team to reach out to other countries.
What's so striking about the description of these charges released by the Mueller people today is how many private conversations are described in detail. Conversations between General Flynn and Ambassador Kislyak, other Russian officials unnamed, a number of unnamed transition officials. It suggests to me that all of this was surveilled by federal investigators. Do you think that's where the description came from, or do you think people at the White House have described these conversations to the Mueller people? And how paranoid would you be if you realize that every phone conversation you had was being listened to by the U.S. government, which apparently is what seems like what's going on?
Well, you have to understand that when you as an American citizen are talking to a foreign agent, whether it's the ambassador or charge or whoever it may be, whether they're in this country or outside the country, that you would suspect that those calls, especially with adversarial governments, would be surveilled.
Right.
So wouldn't you be on guard to that, especially if you're Flynn and you've been in the intelligence community and you've headed an agency? You would think that our government was on the ball. You certainly had privy to the information when you were doing it. So there's no doubt that the FBI has chapter and verse on conversations that were had. So it makes it very easy for them to corroborate or to catch somebody telling something that's not true.
No, I mean, you make a fair point. I mean, you ran an intel agency, but you speak freely to Kislyak, not knowing it's being recorded, and then you speak to the FBI without a lawyer. It's not very bright at all. But there are also a number of conversations described in some detail in this document between Flynn and people on the transition team, American citizens. Do you think those conversations were surveilled, or do you think those transition officials spoke to investigators?
Well, I would hope that it was testimony that was given to investigators and not surveilled, because in order for that to happen, there would have had to have been a warrant, and I would be very interested into how that warrant was made. Was it on information that was corroborated? Was on hearsay? These are things that would be very troubling if, in fact, Americans were being surveilled by law enforcement.
Yeah, well, they are being. Brad, thank you very much. I appreciate it. The Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, joins us next for an exclusive interview. Stay tuned. And as a city views U.S. immigration law with contempt. So what is the Trump administration's response to all of this? We're joined now by the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions. Mr. Attorney General, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Tucker.
So before I ask you about Kate Ainsley, I feel duty-bound to ask you at least one question about the charges we saw today filed against General Flynn. I know you've recused yourself from the investigation, but you were part of the transition team, during which time he was working, in effect, for the Erdogan government as a lobbyist. He hasn't been charged related to that, but it's striking. And my simple question is, did anyone know that he was taking money from a foreign government to forward their aims in the United States?
Well, Tucker, you know, this is part of the special counsel's investigation, and I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment on that now, and we'll just have to see how those cases go.
Okay. Well, with that, I won't keep trying. So to the Kate Ainsley thing, what's your initial reaction? What was last night your initial reaction to the not guilty verdict on the
Well, it was such a sad event. I've gotten to know Mr. Stanley and the son and talked to Mrs. Stanley on the anniversary of that death a few months ago. So it's a personal thing with me. I would just say that it's one of the most tragic stories that anyone could have, to be holding your daughter in your arms like that. But the fundamental question we've got to deal with, and it's time for this country to get its head on straight. These cities should not be protecting criminal aliens, people who come into the country unlawfully, then they commit another crime, and then they hide that individual and don't let them, as they did with Zapata, be turned over to the ICE officers so they can be properly deported.
So the killer, and he is the killer, is now being deported?
That will be his ultimate fate. We are confident, and we are going to do everything possible to ensure that happens, although there are some potential other charges that could be brought against him. And before being deported and released, we think he should face every charge that is proper to be brought against him. And you can be sure our Department of Justice is working right now to bring any charges that are appropriate. One warrant has been released on him because he has violated his terms of release in his prior federal conviction for returning to the country unlawfully. So he's got one warrant we know that's already outstanding that would hold him for more prison time.
So he was able to shoot and kill Kate Steinle because officials in San Francisco released him from jail despite Justice Department requests to hold him for deportation. So that there's a clear connection between the sanctuary city policy in San Francisco and the murder of this young woman. And yet those policies are still in place in San Francisco and in an increasing number of cities around the country. And the federal government seems impotent in the face of that. Doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it. Why?
It is a very frustrating situation right now. I would just say the federal government had this individual, was holding him and going to deport him, but San Francisco put a detainer on him basically, and we turned him over to complete the sentence there, and they refused to turn him back over to us, released him into the city, and that's how this happened. So the federal government and President Trump is crystal clear. We are doing everything possible to get these cities to reverse these policies. We do not believe they should receive any money that they are not lawfully entitled to under the grant procedures of this country, and we're going to work hard on that. We're facing incredible legal obstacles at this moment, but we're confident, and we will continue to fight on appeal. We're confident the Supreme Court, if not the lower courts, will rule eventually in our favor. But right now, you get a nationwide injunction. You file one of these lawsuits before a favorable judge, one of 600 in the country. You pick a judge, you file the lawsuit, and then they issue a nationwide injunction stopping the entire federal government for enforcing its laws. And I'm really, we've got to fight this, and we will.
I mean, there's precedent for this going back 50 years and more, where various cities in the South ignored federal law and were made to obey it because it's federal law. So if you can ignore immigration law with basically impunity and get one of the 600 federal judges you mentioned to ratify your decision, then why is any federal law enforceable?
Well, it's just amazing to me why any city would not want to rid itself of criminals who are also in the country illegally. Why would they want to maintain them in this country when they're committing additional crimes against the peace and dignity of the city? So I think we need to keep the pressure on them. I urge them to reverse these policies, and we will withhold any monies that we can lawfully withhold from them.
So that's my question, though. I mean, you all have been saying that. Even there were some Democratic politicians 2 years ago when Kate Steinle was murdered who said the same thing, and nothing has changed, and they become even more flamboyant in their defiance of federal law. And so is there nothing that the feds can do unilaterally to try and bring them into compliance with federal law?
We are seeking expedited review on appeal. We expect to win these cases, and we expect that these cities and jurisdictions will lose federal dollars as a result of it. Congress could help us. We've got good legislation that passed the House, the Kate Steinle bill that increases punishments, and we have a sanctuary cities bill that would help us a great deal. They're being stalled in the Senate, but Congress really needs to pass some legislation. And that would be a tremendous benefit to us.
So why, I mean, you're uniquely positioned to answer this question since you spent decades in the Senate. On what grounds are they being stalled in the Senate? Who would stop a bill designed to prevent crimes like this, and why would that person do so?
It seems like to me it wouldn't take 5 minutes to pass the Kate Steinle bill that passed out of the House with a good vote. It shouldn't take any time to pass additional legislation that would provide greater incentive and greater pressure on cities who are failing to cooperate with the federal government in basic immigration law.
Right.
So yes, I don't see any basis for not moving this, and would love to see them move it. They've got the tax bill right now, but as soon as possible, I'd like to see this legislation be advanced in the Senate.
You'd think lawmakers would care when the laws they make are ignored, but I guess not. But Mr. Attorney General, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tucker.
The only reason this man was able to murder Kate Steinle, of course, was because San Francisco was protecting him from deportation despite 5 prior deportations and 7 felony convictions. Ryan Eller is Executive Director at Define American, and he joins us now. Mr. Eller, thanks a lot for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tucker.
So what's the lesson of this?
You know, this is a real tragedy, and I can tell you as a person of faith, we mourn the loss of everybody who dies at the hands of violence, and I hope the whole nation continues to pray, as I think Attorney General just said he was, for the family of, you know, Kate Steinle. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this. I think it's a legitimate conversation to have about our criminal justice system. I think where we start getting into really troubled waters is when we, you know, talk more about sanctuary cities and relationships between local governments and federal governments, and somehow make this more about immigrants and immigration as opposed to this really tragic and unfortunate case.
Well, I mean, but this case was specifically about immigration. This was someone who'd been deported from the country 5 times rather, but convicted 7 times of felonies, who shouldn't have been here, and was only on the street because the city ignored the federal law and the request from the Obama administration's Justice Department, by the way, to hold him. And so, I mean, it actually wouldn't have happened with different immigration policies. So you don't think that's fair to draw those connections?
Well, here's what I do know. I'm a follower of Scripture, and in Leviticus it says, treat the immigrant as a citizen among you. And if the Attorney General wants to bring charges and follow the letter of the law, it seems to me that this person has, had due process and gone to court, and a jury has made some decisions in this case.
Wait, just to be clear, are you suggesting that the federal government ought to abide by the laws spelled out in Leviticus?
No, I'm suggesting that the federal government would like to treat this person according to the laws within our land. That would be fair, and I think that that's what we expect within our justice system. What I would also suggest, though, regarding your point on sanctuary cities, is that all of the empirical research says that cities with sanctuary policies are actually safer.
Actually, I don't know. The empirical evidence does not say that, and I know that this isn't your area, so I won't attack you for it. But in fact, that's wrong. And there's no evidence that a sanctuary city. Well, actually, this has been studied, and there's no evidence that sanctuary policies make a city safer. In fact, there's some evidence they make them more dangerous. But the point is, look, I don't understand why religious figures, clearly yourself included, would encourage municipalities to ignore federal law when I don't see why that's your role, actually, as a faith leader. And if it's okay for people to ignore this federal law, why isn't it okay for them to ignore gun control laws or laws about paying your taxes? When did clergy get on the side of ignoring the law? I don't see any precedent for that in the New Testament. Do you?
Oh, absolutely. I think if we view the law as unjust and as marginalizing particular communities, sure. But the issue of sanctuary is fundamentally about asking the federal government to do its job and local governments to do its job. I don't care whether they call it sanctuary or not. I, frankly, Tucker, prefer that we use that term in faith communities and not local governments. I pay my taxes as a citizen to my local government to protect local taxpayers, and those taxpayers include undocumented Americans, some of whom are now, unfortunately, afraid to call the police if they're being abused or if a crime's being committed on them because they're afraid of deportation.
The people who are here illegally, I wish you showed as much concern for the people who are here legally, who were born here, who abided by the rules, who came here legally. I don't understand the emphasis, the total emphasis on people who are breaking the law over and against people who are following the law. I think it's bizarre, actually.
Well, you know, I mean, you're, I think, trying to make people criminalize when actually being in this country without the proper authorization is not a crime. It's a civil offense.
Right. Okay.
And so I think we should be clear about that.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, Tuck.
Senate Republicans are said to be very close to passing their version of tax reform. We'll bring you an update from Congress and discuss what exactly is in that bill. Many people still don't know. Stay tuned. With the latest developments. Ed, what's up?
Tucker, great to see you. The Mike Flynn guilty plea overshadowed a bit what is a huge day for the president. He's on the verge of a dramatic victory, delivering on that big, beautiful tax cut he's been promising. Breaking late today, Republican Bob Corker, who, like John McCain, has been basically feuding with the president, announced he's voting no on the tax cut because of concerns it will add too much to the national debt. But in the end, his opposition might not matter much because other Republicans on the fence, like McCain, Susan Collins, came on board, giving Mitch McConnell what is expected to be a much-needed victory after that big failure on repealing and replacing Obamacare. The president has already been touting a stock market that has been on fire until today's news about Flynn. The Dow yesterday seeing its 63rd record close this year, and it could be roaring again after some of these changes. On the corporate side, you'll see the corporate tax rate dropping from 35% down to about 20%. They're expanding write-offs allowed for companies that are buying new equipment. And on the personal side, despite Democratic claims that this helps very few people, the Joint Committee on Taxation says 60% of U.S. households will get a tax cut. 8% will pay more. And despite all the charges, this will only help the rich. That same committee found that for families making between $50,000 to $75,000 per year, 80% get a tax cut of $100 or more. Now, a lot of last-minute changes to get enough Republicans on board. Democrats furious that literally some of these changes are being handwritten into the text of the bill, so they're still working it out. The vote they were hoping to have tonight in the Senate may be sliding until tomorrow, a rare Saturday session. But the bottom line is Mitch McConnell has suggested they have the votes to give the president a victory on this, Tucker.
Ed Henry, thanks for that.
Good to see you.
One notable part of this tax plan is that it will eliminate the tax deduction that currently exists for interests on student loans. Sal Mastra was the national youth spokesman for the Trump campaign. He says deleting this deduction could be devastating to an entire generation. He joins us to explain. So, Sal, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I don't think most people are aware of this. So give us an explanation of what this is.
So I wasn't aware of it till a couple of days ago, and I was all for this tax bill. And let me preface this by saying I support the president 100%. I always have, always will. I think he's done a great job so far, and I think this tax bill hits a bunch of high notes that will bring a lot of wealth, jobs, and innovation back to the country. But when looking at bringing all that innovation back and looking at the next great American workforce, we have to look at millennials who have been devastated by the Great Recession and by Obama's weak, anemic recovery. And so having these student loan interest deductions helps them a lot. So right now, about 25% of student loan borrowers are currently in default, deferment, or forbearance. That's over $300 billion of the $1.4 trillion in outstanding student loan debt. Now, right now, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Department of the Treasury, and the Federal Reserve have all warned in statements and testimony that the current student loan debt in this country at $1.4 trillion is as dangerous to the economy as the housing bubble was in 2007.
I think that's right. Yes.
Yep. And so we desperately need to keep this in there, and I urge House Republicans and the president to make sure that this is in there before it gets back, because not only will this be devastating to my generation when it comes to their future economically and reaching milestones like buying a house and cars and getting married, having kids, it's bad for Republicans politically. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, these socialist Democrats. They're going out there and they're talking about how bad this is for the middle class, which is mostly young people and their families. And so going out and saying, look, the Republicans gave a 15% tax break to these evil corporations making billions and billions of dollars, but they took away your student loan deductions. It's not good either way.
And, evil may be a little strong, but some of those corporations are not in sync at all with the Republican values or conservative values at all. But here's my question.
That's their talking point.
To some extent, they're not far off from a conservative perspective. A lot of these corporations are deeply hostile to traditional understanding of conservatism, for sure. But
Yep.
Isn't it kind of beyond dispute that one of the reasons young people, or the poorest group of Americans, aren't getting married, aren't buying vehicles, aren't buying homes, aren't launching out of their own parents' homes in a lot of cases, is the weight of student loan debt?
That's exactly it. I mean, 30% of millennials have had to move back in with their parents because they simply cannot afford it. Right now, about 50% of current college graduates are working in a job that requires a high school diploma or less, and about 300,000 are working for minimum wage. They can't afford to pay these back, and they won't be able to if any of this continues, especially getting rid of the deduction. And, you know, talking about how bad it is and how bad millennials want out of student loan debt, a third of them have said they would sell an organ to pay off their student loans.
So maybe has it occurred to anyone that maybe one of the reasons young people are so radical politically, and that's bad news for America, is because their economic future has been thwarted in part by these loans? Like, this is causing social turmoil.
Exactly. And don't get me wrong, we definitely need higher education reform in this country.
I agree.
ASAP. And that includes dealing how student loans are given out, qualifications for them, etc. And so when you look at that and you look at how bad the recession was for millennials and how they haven't really been able to recover, and how the notion that that was all brought about by Republicans and ideals and conservative values and capitalism, you get this equation. I mean, right now, you know, the new poll out of the Communist Memorial Fund found that 44% of millennials would rather live in a socialist society than a capitalist one. And so we have a lot to
terrifying,
go on
and
PR.
this is one of the reasons why I think. Sal, thank you for bringing this to our attention.
And we can't leave it out. Thank you, Tucker.
Good to see you. Hillary Clinton has a lot of accomplishments that would include returning slavery to Libya. We'll tell you how that happened next. Six years ago, U.S. intervention under the Clinton administration, Obama administration rather, helped topple Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi from power. As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton helped push for that intervention. And then this happened.
That is the land of unconfirmed reports.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
Did it have anything to do with your visit?
No, I'm sure it did.
Here she is bragging about toppling the government of Libya. Pretty fun diversion for the Secretary of State. She's bragged about it for years after, but actual Libyans didn't find it as amusing. They've been suffering ever since. In the vacuum created by Gaddafi's fall, an ancient institution, in fact, has been revived: slavery. Glenn Reynolds is a law professor at the University of Tennessee. He recently wrote about this, and he joins us tonight. Glenn, thank you for coming on. This is one of those stories where we just couldn't let it go. You know, you see these politicians make decisions, particularly foreign policy decisions. They declare victory, and no one checks to see what the aftermath is like. You did. Tell us what the effect of this decision was on the people of that country.
Well, it's been a debacle, of course. It goes back to 2003 when we made an agreement with Muammar Gaddafi, the strongman who ran Libya, that if he would give up his weapons of mass destruction, we wouldn't try to overturn him. And we didn't keep that promise. In 2011, Hillary Clinton, together with Susan Rice and Samantha Power and the Obama administration, decided to kick him out of power. They bombed and got rid of him, and as you can see, sort of gloated after he was killed by a mob. And there wasn't much of a plan on what to do next, other than some advice Hillary's advisor Sidney Blumenthal gave her about how to fit this into her presidential campaign plans. And now Libya's torn up with civil war. You've got fighting militias. You had a wave of refugees passing through Libya. A lot of them got stuck in Libya, and now some of them are being sold essentially as slaves in slave markets to work on farms and that sort of thing there. And CNN covered that, BBC covered that, and it became a story last week. And I saw it, and I thought, you know, this is a real mess. I mean, we heard about this, we knew it was bad, but years later, Hillary has sort of gotten off scot-free on this. People don't bring it up, and yet this is a royal debacle.
Of course it is. And Susan Rice and Samantha Power never hold to account for this. But I wonder what effect it has on the countries in the region around the world. I mean, next time we go to a leader, a strongman somewhere, and say, look, you know, disarm and we'll reward you, why would anybody ever follow those instructions again?
Oh, we're ruined for a generation with this. I mean, right now, you know, we'd like Kim Jong-un to give up his nukes,
right,
and he probably wouldn't anyway, but we certainly can't make him any promises he'd believe, because who would?
That's an excellent point. Has there been any soul-searching on the part of the people who did this? They wrecked an entire country and threw the whole region into chaos. Has anyone apologized or said, you know, maybe we've learned something from this?
You know, not really. During the 2016 campaign, in one of the early primary debates when Senator James Webb was still running, he raised the issue with Hillary, and she just sort of blew it off and said, oh, no, it was a big success. I've certainly never heard Samantha Power, who was pushing this as part of an effort to establish a doctrine of international law called responsibility to protect as a justification for intervention. Never heard her say, oh, gee, we kind of blew that. Although you notice that responsibility to protect didn't get brought up again after this.
Of course not. Now that they're selling slaves in the market. One of the least impressive people ever to serve at a high level of government. Professor, thank you for bringing this to the attention of our viewers. It's worth it.
Thank you.
Well, advances in artificial intelligence and robotics are causing the automation of more and more jobs, many jobs, and it's going to have a massive effect on working class employment in this country. Mike Rowe is here next to explain what's likely to happen. It may not be as apocalyptic as a Terminator movie, but robots do seem to be taking over the country. Automation has already eliminated millions of middle-class manufacturing jobs. Fast food restaurants are experimenting with burger-making robots. Soon, self-driving cars could remove the livelihood for millions of American truck, taxi, and delivery drivers. What will the future look like when machines have made human workers obsolete? Former Dirty Jobs host Mike Rowe has thought about this quite a bit, and he joins us tonight on set. Hey, Mike.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So is this an, I mean, it feels like an ominous development, is it?
Look, I'm neither a historian or an economist, but you know the Luddite Rebellion.
Very well.
Right. So 1820, Napoleonic Wars are over. Times are hard in England, and the weavers are upset because the looms are all the rage.
Yes.
And the looms are coming to take our jobs, and that was the meme, that was the trope, and then there was bloodshed. I think they hung a couple dozen of those guys by the time the dust settled.
Yes.
So from what I've read and from what I've seen, in some way, shape, or form, the robots have been coming since then. You know, from the cotton gin to our own industry. You know, we've talked about the displacement theory and the way that you know, that TV was going to destroy newspapers and that cinema was going to end television and how the internet was going to end cinema. It never really happens the way we think it's going to happen. So I guess because of the show I used to do and because I'm running this foundation that's sort of work-centered, people ask me all the time if the robots are, not if they're coming, but when and how bad is it going to be?
Yeah, how bad is it going to be?
Well, I don't know, but historically it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as we think.
That's actually heartening.
I'm an optimist.
As a prediction. So one of the things that technology has unleashed is the internet and the ability for people anonymously to make claims that are untrue.
Yeah.
And among the many claims that are untrue on the internet is the male enhancement company that apparently stole your identity. Really? Yeah, really. I mean, not that I would know, not that they emailed me or anything, but you were a false version, and Earthsat's Mike Rowe was selling male enhancement products on the internet.
With great success, apparently. There was a very, very detailed advertisement along with a really detailed interview that never took place with me. Okay, about my, as my father put it, my problems in the boudoir. This was brought to my attention through an email that my dad sent me, which he, you know, he's like the town crier. He reads everything about me to my mother. He saw the ad and read the interview. And in the interview, I said that this new product that I had found made big changes. Big, bold changes for me. Transformed my life. Now, it's got my face, my name, and like 300 or 400 words in quotes from me, ostensibly, explaining how life was sad and disappointing until I got my hands on whatever this stuff was, Testo Max, ate it, and then stand back. I don't know how big this thing gets, right? It was bananas. And so I had to explain to my mother and my father that the interview didn't take place, that I'm not a spokesman for a company that does this. And it was baffling because it wasn't just a fake ad. It was a fake ad that appeared on a fake page from Us Weekly. And it also appeared in a fake page from Sports Illustrated and Playboy. So what these companies do, you talk about fake news all the time. Obviously, it is what it is, but fake advertising has always led the charge. And so I went on the Facebooks and I wrote about the egregious claims and the humility of having to talk to your parents about the fact that you never needed the product in the first place. But
was there any recourse? Did you get the ads taken down?
The next day, I mean, no, there's nothing you can do because they constantly change the algorithm behind it. So it's this shape-shifting thing. But I got a call from the Better Business Bureau the next morning saying, look, this is very brave of you to come out and talk about this. I'm not brave, I'm just annoyed. And they're like, well, we should talk about really getting behind this because dozens of celebrities, yes, Dad, I'm a celebrity, their names and likenesses have been co-opted to sell products that make you more all that.
They've been selling Testomax too. There's a fine line between annoyed and brave.
There really is. You know, I mean, it's incredibly blurry these days. and in fact, I have no idea. It's a curved line.
It's a curved line. I will stop with that. Mike Roth, it's always great to see you. Thank you.
Sure.
More news. We're keeping an eye on the tax vote. We'll bring the latest right after this. Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. In just a moment, Attorney General Jeff Sessions joins us for an exclusive interview to talk about the day's avalanche of news. But first tonight, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI. He's announced he is cooperating with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's ongoing investigation. Flynn admits he lied about the extent of the conversations he had with the Russian ambassador to Washington, Sergei Kislyak. Flynn is the first member of the Trump administration to be criminally charged in this investigation, so this is a major development. The question is, what exactly does it mean? Flynn has admitted taking money from an unfriendly foreign government, the Erdogan regime in Turkey, in order to influence American policy as the incoming national security advisor. If that's not illegal, it ought to be illegal. It's certainly a betrayal of trust and possibly a betrayal of this country's vital national interests. It's appalling behavior. It's also depressingly common in Washington, which may be why Flynn has not been prosecuted for it. It's so conventional, nobody considers it wrong, though it is wrong. But back to the charges that were actually filed today. Keep in mind that Mueller's probe began in order to investigate claims that Russia influenced the 2016 election or even directly colluded with the Trump campaign in order to alter the outcome of that election. Flynn's guilty plea today does not prove that claim. In fact, it undercuts it. Flynn admits he lied about initiating contact with Kislyak last December. Check a calendar. That's a month after the November election. Too late to sink the Hillary campaign. There goes that theory. Instead, Flynn was apparently trying to promote U.S. interests. According to the indictment of him today, passed out by the Mueller people, he urged Russia not to overreact to sanctions implemented by the Obama administration, and he urged Russia also not to veto a UN resolution condemning Israel. By the way, that second effort failed. Now, you can debate whether it was a good idea or not for the Trump transition team to contact foreign representatives before formally taking power. Maybe it wasn't a good idea, but there certainly is precedent for it. In 2008, Barack Obama repeatedly had his surrogates meet with foreign officials. In 1980, Vice President-elect George H.W. Bush spoke with numerous ambassadors on Ronald Reagan's behalf. When Robert Mueller was first named special counsel, we warned, as many did, that these investigations rarely stay limited to their original purpose, and they frequently